There's another legendary that's best in slot for you. It's gloves, and what it does is it's like a retractable glove that you can pull things from like really far away to you. And there's another thing, the boots, the blood boots, that they actually just drop this haze of blood around you, and it hurts everything that's down, that's around you. And I mean, these are some really good legendaries.
Wait a second, you're talking about Death Knight, you son of a bitch!
Hey guys, welcome back to another video. Today we are going to be talking about Outlaw. We're going to be talking about picking a spec based off of flavor, less about viability. And to help me with that today we have Kaggo, as always.
Hey.
And joining us today is my good friend Layan. How you doing, Layan?
I'm doing well. How are you? Thanks for having me.
So you are a Outlaw spec main, correct?
Yes, I am.
So what goes into making that decision? Because I don't think it's a secret here, and you play it, so obviously you know. Outlaw isn't highly sought after in a lot of grading groups.
Well, for me personally, early on in the expansion, I know I started with Outlaw because it was pretty top tier at the time. But since then, I just kind of fell in love with the spec, the way the mechanics worked, and my main reason for really doing it is because I just like the theme around the spec, honestly. I think the theme around the spec's really enjoyable, and it's just sort of a fun time to play it now in stark contrast to when I used to play it when it was pretty like meta, I guess you could say.
So just so for me and for everyone that's watching, did you start the expansion as Outlaw, like coming into it, or have you always played Outlaw? Well, I guess it would be combat.
So I guess as a little tad brief rundown. I mean, I started really hardcore raiding back in Wrath of the Lich King. I was combat, start that expansion, and I moved to assassination. I was assassination through Cataclysm, and I was assassination in Mists of Pandaria, and then I went back to combat in Draenor, and I switched between that and assassination. And then once this expansion started, I started leveling up as subtlety. I just didn't enjoy it at all, and I switched over to Outlaw. And at the time when we started raiding in this expansion, Outlaw was a top 3 spec for DPS. So I would say that my most experienced spec throughout Rogues is a tie between combat or Outlaw and assassination.
Okay, kind of interesting. You say that you switched from like combat to assassination and then back to combat and assassination through the expansions. What was that decision based off of, or were you following quote unquote the meta?
At the time, it was just following the meta straight up. There would be some times where I just, especially in combat, I just didn't like the way my numbers were. There was, and we might get into it in a little bit, but there were certain abilities that the old combat used to have that were super bursty for some fights. But assassination would just have more controlled DPS over the course of a fight. And if the guild I was in was struggling on a certain fight, like for example in ICC during Wrath, we really struggled on Blood Queen Lanethel for a little bit, and I was bursting really hard, but then dropping off at the end of the fight, so I needed something to sustain the whole fight, and that's when I would switch over to assassination.
And was that based off of sort of I don't know how best to put it, your want to do more damage, or was it purely like we can't beat this unless we have enough damage to get through this requirement?
I mean, you know me. I mean, the people out there listening don't know me as well as you do, obviously. I'm my own biggest critic, so it was always purely my want to be doing more damage. I felt like if I wasn't in maybe top 3 in the guild, then I just personally wasn't doing my part, because I felt like I put enough time in my character where I should be at that point. So it was always for me, how could I get the most out of my character from the spec that I'm playing? And there was other times where I would just simply have better stat weights for the gear that I had, and sometimes my stat weights were just better for the other spec, so I'd switch over to the other spec. I knew both rotations like the back of my hand, so it wasn't too much of an issue for me to hop in between. And I was lucky enough to also have a very supportive guild where I was able to get best in slot weapons for both specs pretty early on. So my fluidity from switching between specs was really easy.
Well, you and I, and Kaggo as well, we've been playing to get together since Warlords, correct?
Yeah.
I remember when we started out, you were one of our few DPS that could actually pull, you know, respectable numbers, if you will. Kag and I were both tanking at the time, and I remember there were some fights that it was like Kilrog comes to mind in particular, probably much to the behest of Kaggo, but Kilrog had a steep DPS requirement, and it sort of, I think if I recall correctly, you were playing Assassination, or you bounced between the two?
At the time, I would bounce between the two. I know specifically on the Kilrog fight, I want to say that I was playing combat because I can remember blade flurrying on when I went through the little portal thing to get to the phase where you had to kill all the ads that came flying at you. And anyone that's familiar with the Kilrog fight will know what I'm talking about, obviously. I remember using blade flurry on that and coming out and having the damage buff and then hitting my burst, and then it would end up like on meters I was doing like 40-something% of groups damage and stuff at the time. I remember combat was like super overpowered for that fight, but then in other fights in that raid, it's just combat is really good bursting, and then it just can't keep up after that.
Okay. Well, I want to talk about specifically Legion and like how you feel about it in its current iteration. Start with like, I don't know, 7.1 when we first started into Emerald Nightmare.
Okay, well, 7.1 early on in the expansion, back when mythics were this whole new thing, like the dungeons, everyone was bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, running into this new world. As an outlaw rogue, life was awesome. Everyone wanted you for their mythic runs because you cleaved better than any other class in the game. You were able to just pull all these ridiculous numbers in mythics. Your groups never had any issues. And then once we got an Emerald Nightmare, it was like the cleave was there, and then also the single target was there without a drop off at all. And I mean, you can remember pretty vividly. Like, I was on top of the world at the time. 7.1 was like Outlaw was like a new thing still, and it was like not comparable to like early Wrath Death Knights, but it was pretty damn powerful. And I think anyone that's played Outlaw Rogue in this expansion is gonna like understand that.
Yeah,
It's pretty powerful.
if I recall, there were times where we would be fighting, I don't remember, progression boss. Maybe we were progressing on Il'gynoth or something, and you would hit a 6 proc, and it would be like, okay, lust now. And that was literally our strategy for getting through some bosses.
Yep, absolutely. And again, especially on a fight like Il'gynoth with the cleave and stuff, if we were ever struggling with stuff, especially bringing all those blobs down to the eye, just the cleave, and I would spec into death from above specifically for that fight too. And once I hit it, it's like the amount of output that you put and the amount of just not like self-sustained output too. Like, it was useful for the whole group for me to be having that output. It was controlled, is what made it, I think, such a good spec early on in this expansion, which is why it was like, from what I recall, remembering looking at any of the websites that kind of outlined the meta for anyone that pays attention to that, it listed it as a top 3 spec for DPS. And at the time, people need to understand, at the time, all the rogue specs were really high up there, but Outlaw was like a slightly cut above the other two.
Okay, so let's talk about 7.2. And I know that you took a little bit of a break from the game during this point, but coming back into the game, tail end of Nighthold, and I think you did raid a little bit, if not raid, but did some Mythic Pluses in between there. But It was clearly a different spec by the time that you got back into the game. What were your observations there?
Um, so I used to tell one of my friends that I would play with on this game 7.1. It felt like my damage in a way would almost ramp up as the fight went on. Like my character would build a sort of like momentum, and once his energy starts pooling, he's getting his saber slash is like recasting. Like he's getting double hits on my saber slash and everything. It felt awesome. I would say once I came back to 7.2, and I don't think it was necessarily a gear check. I think it was just something that the way that they changed the spec, the saber slashes stopped hitting twice as much, and the spec just felt almost energy starved a lot, and the attacks just felt a lot slower. And I could go from anywhere from doing like 150k single target to like 450k single target, all dependent on what rolls I had and just how often my saber slash was striking a second time. So it was a pretty big change. It was a pretty drastic change, and it was one that I didn't really at the time kind of think of. The spec just sucks now. It was sort of like, wow, I've been away from the game for so long. It must be my gear or something. But obviously, they did kind of nerf it down quite a fair bit.
Okay. You've recently come back into the game. We've both been raiding together again. How about now? Now that Outlaw sort of, because it did see another round of changes and stuff. I know recently you found out that your gear, actually the stat weights were all wrong and stuff, and that affected it as well. But is it coming around? What are your thoughts on the current, like the very current this patch iteration of your spec?
I'd say for an overall basis, comparing it to all the other specs right now, it's about middle of the road, if not middle of the road, slightly below. It's very low compared to the other two rogue specs. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me on that one. It has its usefulness. Some fights, like Mistress and Harjatan, you know, everyone loves to have me in the raid group for that, obviously. Sisters a little bit. There's that extra cleave that you can get onto the owl and stuff. It has its usefulness. But then there's fights like Goroth, and it's like, oh, his burst starts off really high, and then it drops right off. It's so just dependent on certain specific procs that it really hurts itself. But I will say that it's fun when you get those procs, which is what I really like enjoy about it in a way. Is getting those procs is like you feel like a god almost. Anyone that's played Outlaw out there, in my entire time of playing this game, my character has not felt more powerful than when I get the full benefit from Roll the Bones. When all of the buffs proc at once, you are like a god. But then on the other side of that, you get one proc from Roll the Bones, and it's like your worst one. Because there actually is a tier list, especially for different encounters on this, of which buffs are the best and which ones aren't. And when you get the worst one, it's just awful. And especially in a fight like Goroth, it just really hurts you. You're not pooling energy. You have to waste it on another Roll the Bones, your combo points, instead of a run through, which just a huge DPS drop off. And it shows, man. It shows really badly. I think on logs, like I don't know any outlaw rogues that are running logs on Goroth that are parsing over like a 45% maybe is the highest I could see one being. So, like I said, again, it just has its usefulness in some fights. In other fights, it really, really, really just drops off.
It kind of this brings up the point that I've been noticing with a lot of players of the current cycles, Legion and everything. I've been noticing people stick with these classes. You know, there's always flavor of the month players or whatever, but there are people that stick with their spec no matter what. And you've clearly had a history of switching to the most viable spec at the time. What's sort of keeping you at combat at this point? I mean, you've said it has really good burst potential, and that's nice and everything, but competitively, it's just not viable.
I feel that I'm still able to do a good enough job in a raid group where I'm not setting the whole team back. For starters, so I'm never like uncomfortable. I mean, we've had conversations. You know, I get pretty frustrated sometimes in my damage output, but it's something that I'm fixing a little bit with reworking the stats and stuff. Um, I love the theme behind the spec. I love building my little pirate transmog behind the spec. You guys know what I'm talking about. Kaggo, that's Kaggo's favorite thing about the spec is the whole
Oh
pirate
yeah,
transmog I put onto it.
it's class fantasy.
Um, honestly, the biggest reason, genuinely, why I haven't made a full switch over to subtlety or assassination yet is the artifact weapon system. My artifact on this is, even with catch-up, is so much further ahead that I don't feel necessarily that I either have the time or don't want to commit the time to switching over completely, because I feel like it would be such a difference and such a loss to everything that I've worked for up to this point in the expansion that I feel like all my time would have been wasted.
And I don't think anyone can argue that Outlaw doesn't have the potential to be good, because I mean I've seen logs, and Outlaw has one of the biggest variants from high to low damage in the game, because of the nature of the spec. It's just not consistent. You can't say, okay, I do about this much damage on every fight, unless you're talking about cleave fights where you can say, no, I'm bringing this to the table no matter what. What about your spec is, in your opinion, are your favorite parts about it, the things that they either added or they kept that just really bring that spec, it makes it your spec, if you will?
Um, I absolutely love the artifact weapon ability. I also love Adrenaline Rush as a cooldown. That was always a cooldown that I really enjoyed having. And Blade Flurry, again, Blade Flurry is just, I don't know if there's a better ability in this game than Blade Flurry. Like, I'm sure everyone's been in a group with a happy rogue that just runs around blade flurrying everything and accidentally pulling a bunch of stuff, and then everyone hates him. But then he'll also save you some pulls by just having that perfect cleave. But yeah, like you said, what do I enjoy about the class is just it does a good job of calling back to the old combat, but also making it its own spec still now. And I always enjoyed playing combat, and I thoroughly enjoy playing this. I just enjoy the whole kind of theme behind the spec. I think it's interesting. I think World of Warcraft needs more themed type specs like this, if you will. I guess what I really enjoy about Outlaw as compared to combat is, and it's funny because it's one of the Outlaw's biggest knocks, is like it doesn't have a certainty, it doesn't have a consistency, is Outlaw's its own spec. And where it hurts it is also its blessing, where it doesn't have a debuff that you need to constantly maintain unless you're running Ghostly Strike. You just need to worry about keeping your buffs up. But the fun part about keeping your buffs up can be when you finally get that proc where all of them roll in at once and you just turn into like a god. And the old combat never had that. In the old combat, if you hit a wall in a fight, if you messed your rotation up, there is no recovering it. Your DPS is going to be low the whole fight. In this Outlaw, man, I've seen myself go from like 7th on a meter up to 2 because I got a really good proc, and for just like 50 seconds, I'm just constant 2 mil crits over and over and over again. Every like 1 or 2 seconds, 2 mil crit. So it's got massive amounts of upside and a massive basement floor too. But combat was always just like this steady little thing that you'd always knew would drop off. So I think Outlaw in a way is better than combat for that, I would have to say.
What about thematically? And I want to open this one up to Cag as well, because I know that class fantasy is a big thing, but thematically, being like this pirate, it's different than combat, which was, to my understanding, sort of like a duelist, if you will, a sword wielding.
No real theme behind combat. It wasn't a very inspired like spec. I mean, you have your subtlety now, and the old subtlety focused more on bleeds. The new one's shadow damage, but it's like you're lurking in the shadows, so it makes sense. You had your assassination, which is the poisons. You know what I mean? It makes sense for a rogue. And now you have your outlaw, which is your pirate. Your, I guess, the truest spec to the word rogue would be your pirate, your rogue, the guy that acts alone, the guy that self-motivated. He's got his pistol. He's running around hitting people with his sabers, shooting them in the face with his little blunderbuss. You know what I mean? He does things by his own rules. He's got like bribe. You can bribe people in the open world. It's like fun little abilities in the spec are just fun to play around with. That's why I think it's so fascinating. And I think the two of you will agree with me on this because you both main warriors. There's a spec like warrior. It's just kind of seems almost uninspired. What is the difference between arms and fury except for dual wielding two-handed weapons? You're both just some angry dude that hits stuff and gets rage.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? There's no
Yeah.
theme behind that.
We could get into that. I do actually want to, but maybe I'll save it for another video. But Outlaw, I know Kag, I know you're a huge advocate of pirates. What's your take?
I know, like, I'm just sitting over here and I was like, if I was Layan, like, all my answers would pretty much revolve around, like, the last 20 seconds that he was talking about. Like, man, I want to be a pirate. I want to have, like, this class fantasy and stuff, which was actually kind of interesting. Hear him bring up that kind of, like his own image of that, which I didn't even know he had. Like, you know, this image, like, this self-motivated, you know, blunderbuss, wielding, saber, thrusting dude. It's great. Like, for me, that's what it's all about, is like immersing myself into that. And that's where I get like really selfish and where I'm just probably genuinely not as good of a player as Layan is, because I'm a little bit too selfish and I like that stuff. And it's hard for me to like think and feel on the level that he does when he's in a raid. Like that I'm like too focused on that, right? Because the stuff that Layan gets like this almost tactile response. I can hear that listening to him when it comes to his class and how it's actually functioning in the raid. And that's just something that's super lacking for me. For me, it is all about that class experience, for like wanting to log on to my character because I want to be a pirate, or wanting to log on my character because I want a heroic leap into a bunch of underlevel mobs and just watch everything die. stuff like that. So
I mean, to touch on that a little bit, some raid nights, you know, I show up, I got my captain title on, I've got my admiral's hat on, I've got my pirate transmog going, I've got the cutlasses out, I've got the poison little enchantment appearance on them, and I've got my little red-winged macaw flying next to me. And I just think that's the coolest thing ever. Like, what other class in this game gets to have that much of a thematic, like, backdrop?
So
You know what I mean? And I like when I go AFK, I like watching it go to the log. Like, I'm sitting on my bed on my laptop watching TV or something, and it goes to the logout screen. I'm just sitting there looking at my little pirate troll, who's an outlaw rogue, and it's just fun. It's funny. It's like what an RPG is about. Like, I'm all for min-maxing your character. I'm all for that. But at the same time, it's like, it's just I think it's genuinely one of the coolest things they've done to this class ever, is just giving it its own theme, its own identity in a way. Where again, like I said, other classes, just some of them just seem so uninspired now. It's like, well, we made a fantasy game, we have to put paladins in. Well, what do paladins do? I don't know. Let's have them do the same thing they do in every game. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
There's Soldiers of the Light, all three specs revolving around the light. And it makes sense at the end of the day, but it just, I feel like they could, if they were to get more inspired with all the specs and sort of rework them minorly. I mean, Outlaw's a major rework compared to what Combat was, but they could do more. And I think Outlaw is the start of something that they should actually really grasp and take and have fun with. They should have fun with it, because I think it would bring a lot of people back to this game. I think that people get uninspired with their classes because there's no difference in some of the classes in this game as to what they would be in another game. And that's just kind of how I feel about it. I mean, I know other people will disagree with me. This video is obviously not talking about how to get subscribers back to the World of Warcraft, but I don't think anyone would disagree with me in the way of saying that if you reworked classes to give them their own identity and give them a fun sort of vibe while still being useful, that it would bring a lot of people coming back, if you will.
It's a bit ironic, isn't it, that you're talking about this because Legion was supposed to be the class fantasy expansion.
Yeah, you're absolutely correct about that. But at the same time, I mean, they did it for some specs. Outlaw, I would think, is the biggest one of all. I could be wrong, but I don't know. It's even Death Knights, like Unholy and Frost. Yeah, they should be these two vastly different things, but it's like, are they really? One dual wields and shoots frost, and the other one puts its diseases on stuff and uses its two-handed weapon. But it's still just like, it's a Death Knight. You're not seeing like a difference in the character. You know what I mean? You're not seeing animations. Like with Outlaw, the dude pulls out a pistol. The other two specs aren't doing that. They're still dual wielding daggers. It's just so much different than the other specs. And like you said, it's the class fantasy expansion, but I don't think they really followed through with that as much as they initially intended to.
Well, what I wanna finish talking about, and I kind of wanna, I don't know, get your take on is originally you said you came into this expansion, as a quote unquote meta player. You picked Outlaw because it was meta. Um, given what we've just talked about and everything that we've sort of seen with Outlaw going forward, if they came out with a way and they said, "Hey, subtlety is the best spec right now. We'll give you your artifact weapon to be the same level as your outlaw weapon, and you can just go and main this. We'll fix your stat weights. You can go play subtlety now." Would you at this point?
Um, I would say yes. I would still be switching back to Outlaw during Mythic Plus runs and stuff, but solely for raiding, I would switch to Subtlety because it is top tier. But I suppose, to answer your question originally, if Blizzard was to just do that completely nice thing and give me all that stuff for free and tell me to go play Subtlety, I probably would do it. Um, I enjoy Subtlety. I think it's a fun spec. I don't have as much fun with it on Outlaw solely because of the theme behind it, and I enjoy being incredibly useful on AoE fights more so than I enjoy being incredibly useful on single target fights. I would do it for raiding, but I don't think Stay Subtlety is a main spec. I would just raid in it. It's a bit of a different dynamic, you know what I mean? At class, that's all three of its specs are DPS. Then rather, it's a lot different of a conversation to have with like a paladin, where all three specs are three different like subclasses of the game. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. I wanted to turn the conversation away from Outlaw and sort of more to a broad sense of playing these meta specs, because there's plenty that are considered, you don't play, oh, now I can't think of one, but you don't play a Demon Hunter tank. It's just not something that you do in raids because you're hurting your raid. It's not as good or whatever. What I want to talk about now is sort of playing, and CAG will be a great example for this, playing a spec that isn't considered quote unquote good versus, well, still I need to get content done. Where the balance falls on that. And CAG, I want to start with you because you main Prot Warrior, which Prot Warrior arguably has a hard skill cap, and it can be okay, but it's still niche even in like the highest levels of play.
Yeah, I don't really understand it myself. I've been called a unicorn, or I don't know. I mean, I know that I would be a better tank if I was a different class, but I don't know how to deal with that. I just like being an orc. Like,
We've talked about this before. Is you becoming a Death Knight, because Death Knights are very easy to play. They're very relatively easy. I don't don't downvote this. But
I was gonna say certain people would take a lot of offense to that.
yeah.
But objectively, it's a lot easier to play Death Knight than it is to say play Prot Warrior. And is it just that you aren't interested in playing that fantasy or any other fantasy? You just want to be sword and shield wearing orc, or does it go beyond that? Is it, no, I need to sort of figure this out, like I owe it to my spec to make this work, or like what goes into that thought process?
Can I interject really quick? And I don't want to answer for you, Kaggo, But I will say, from an outside point of view, having raided with you last expansion predominantly, um, the most fun I've ever seen you have on this game is when you just get to sit there and kind of pseudo roleplay as an orc and hit things with your shield and be this big, tough, dumb, brutish warrior. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know, when I first bought the game, it was just, what classes can an orc be? Let's see. And it's like that was that was a lot of my decision making right there. The rest of it, I don't know if it's really pertinent to the conversation because I'm just super stuck in my ways. Like I put so much effort, to me it's a lot of effort into my character, and I just really don't want to re-roll. I just really don't want to like go through the process of making an alt and doing everything that I've done on another character. Because I already have an orc and it's my main, and like I've really bonded with him as like a character, and it's hard for me to do something different at this point.
It's interesting because I remember having a conversation with you a couple weeks ago where you're like, man, by the time the next expansion rolls around, I just want to be off this warrior. I need to get away from him. So,
Oh, because I hate warrior. Like I genuinely do, and it's not it's not so much like I hate the class fantasy of warrior or something, but it's just I don't feel like people at Blizz know what to do with the class anymore, because
kind of like Layan was saying about, focusing in Outlaw.
It's uninspired. You know what I mean? I mean,
super uninspired.
Kaggo, if you're making an RPG, if anyone out there is making an RPG, what is the first class you're putting in a role-playing game? Warrior. Exactly.
mage, and rogue.
Right. Well, I would say rogue not as much. I would say warrior. Depending on the fantasy setting, paladin's probably really far up there.
Ranger.
Mages are always up there, and then a hunter, and everything else below that's mid tier. You got your rogues, like you got your leather wearing, shadow stepping, whatever, dagger backstabbing. You got your warlocks, the people that dabble in the dark magics, like the anti mage, and then maybe a variation of some type of warrior, i.e., kind of this game Death Knight in a way. So warrior is such a staple. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's been eclipsed by every other class. Like, ugh, it's whatever.
Maybe we'll have to make a video talking about warrior because I know Kaggo and I play warriors and I've got lots to say about Fury.
Yeah,
we can lobby to have warrior removed from the game.
Jeez.
I think it would almost be successful at this point, because like that's pretty much how I would have to role play it. Is like my warrior died and then became a death knight is like probably how I would go about the whole transition, as like derpy and as nerdy as that sounds.
And it's the thing especially about warriors, and I've always noticed this as well, no matter what game you're playing, and this game is very noticeable. If geared correctly, if in the hands of the right human being, like look at I don't know, I'm thinking of a YouTube warrior that's not Swifty because he's a bit of a meme. Someone like Asmongold. If every time you look at an Asmongold video, the dude is just absolutely destroying the damage meters, because the class at its most basic form, it's just like a bare bones class that does a ton of damage, and in the hands of the right person, when statted correctly, near perfectly in someone like his case, it's just so good, and it's such a powerful class. Whereas it almost feels like some of the other classes in melee DPS especially, like, have to be more creative, have to think harder, which is why I think a class such as warrior feels more uninspired, because it's like, me warrior, me hit thing hard, me make thing bleed, repeat.
I just want to point out that your criteria for finding an example was a YouTuber who does lots of damage on a warrior, and your first go-to was Asmongold. I'm sitting right here.
See, you gotta post some videos of you doing tons of damage, because until you do that, it's a myth.
Oh, okay, that's right.
Tons and tons.
I think that pretty much wraps us up for talking about Outlaw and talking about the meta and choosing a class based on meta. I do think that there's more discussion to be had there, but we'll save it for another video. Before we go, is there anything that you guys want to say?
Any of my Outlaw Rogues out there, any of my Rogues in general out there, because I think Rogue is a class more than any other class in the game that has a lot of. There's a personality among Rogues where it's sort of a I'm better than you type of mentality. But you go into that Hall of Shadows, man, there's a lot of inspecting going around. What I'm trying to say is that it's very competitive spec. Any of those Outlaw Rogues out there, hold strong. Any of your Rogues out there in general that don't main Outlaw, give Outlaw a try in PvP. See what it does for you. There's not a more fun feeling than literally killing someone in 2 seconds. Indy sees me do it all the time, so he knows what I'm talking about. Just give it a try, especially when you can chain death from above into some of the stuff. Outlaw Rogues can do a lot more damage than you would think they can. That's what I'm going to wrap it up with. Don't lose hope. We are one. Outlaw Rogues for life.
Kaggo?
Orcs aren't default bad guys. Like the whole thing. Oh, all orcs are bad because someone saw Lord of the Rings when they were 12. No, not at all. Not at all.
Thank you for that PSA.
Also, one last thing. PS to everyone out there. I challenge you to come up with a transmog based around the spec that you are playing. If you can't find one that has a theme around the spec you're playing, it means you're playing an uninspired spec, and you're the one that should reroll.
Whoa. Whoa.
Well, guys, thank you for tuning into this video. If you like this video, give it a like, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Thank you guys for watching. Share this with your friends if you are so inclined, and have a great day.
I'm gonna watch it.
Yo, what's up, ladies? It's me, Layan, looking for a WoW girlfriend. I'm currently single. Add me on my B tag. That's Dingus number 11395. Let's get into it.
Is it really Dingus?